Hi, today we're going to talk about how to lubricate a deep groove open ball bearing before we assemble a horizontal induction motor. Some of what we're going to cover will be steps for lubricating a shaft mounted open bearing and how to lubricate the bearing housing as the last step before we put the end bracket on. As always, follow your company's safety practices, wear the proper personal protective equipment such as safety glasses, including clean latex or nitrile gloves so we don't get material from the grease soaked into your skin. With horizontal induction motors, we normally do this step after we've installed the bearings on the shaft and just before we install the end bracket. So we want to minimize exposure to contamination. Until we're ready to install the end bracket, we're going to protect the bearing with just aluminum foil. So that's really just to keep the dirt and contamination out. So with the bearings mounted and the motor otherwise ready to assemble, double check, make sure that nobody's left the bearing cap or any other internal parts that are supposed to be behind the bearing, and make sure that the grease pipes and grease fittings are clean with no obstructions, no dirt inside the grease pipe. Real common to see people forget to clean grease pipes, so we want to make sure we avoid that. To avoid mixing incompatible greases, we're always going to use the same grease that our customer uses, and that may vary from customer to customer, so make sure we're using the right grease for the customer that this motor goes to. Note that in this example, we're lubricating an open ball bearing, but the procedure for roller bearings or grease-lubricated thrust bearings is going to be essentially the same. Sealed bearings and shielded bearings are pre-lubricated by the bearing manufacturer, and while they don't require any lubrication when we assemble the motor, it is possible that our customers may be re-greasing shielded bearings as part of their regular maintenance activities. But a sealed bearing, we don't want grease fittings installed on the motor. Before we get started, make sure the work surface is clean, that we don't have any debris or dirt or contamination that could somehow get into the grease. And if you're using a 5-gallon grease bucket, make sure the lid is wiped clean before you open it up and start removing grease from it. In this case, we may be pulling grease out of a grease tube for convenience, and that's certainly one way to go. So we'll fill our open bearing with fresh grease from both sides. Doesn't matter which side you start with. Most of us are going to grease the front side that's facing out and then reach behind it to grease the back side. So we'll follow that practice. We really recommend using a plastic putty knife because a metal putty knife could potentially scratch the bearing surfaces. And while that probably wouldn't do any harm, we just want to avoid it. So we'll put a small amount of grease on the facing side of the bearing and force the grease in between the rolling elements for the whole circumference of the bearing on this side. And then we'll use the same procedures to pack grease into the back side of the bearing between the rolling elements there. Any excess grease that we have on either side of the bearing, we're simply going to use our putty knife, wipe that off, and we'll transfer that immediately to the bearing housing, the inside of the end bracket. We've got to pack that about 1/3 full anyway. Don't return excess grease to your original container because you run the risk of contaminating a pretty expensive container full of grease. So next we're going to pack that excess grease into the bearing housing, and we'll fill the bearing cavity portion of that about 1/3 full of grease, but just the portion that actually is intended to hold grease. Don't overfill the housing because it may displace enough air that the grease is going to cause the bearing to run hot. And if it runs hot, we're going to have a reduced bearing life. And if we really overpack it, we may have grease migrating through the inside bearing cap down into the windings and potentially damaging our winding insulation long term. A lot of mechanics like to wipe a little bit of fresh grease onto the bearing fit of the housing itself so that it makes the bearing bracket easier to slide into place. And we're going to follow the same procedure we just talked about and demonstrated to grease the bearing on the opposite end of the motor. Now that we've lubricated both bearings and housings, we're ready to finish assembling the motor. Thanks for watching. Join us again soon for more electric motor repair tips.